on stage, there's 5,000 people out there coughing and sneezing and laughing and cheering.
For nearly 3 decades, Cliff Richard was treated as one of Britain's safest celebrities. Clean image, religious values, family-friendly fame, the kind of public figure parents trusted without hesitation. But behind that carefully protected reputation, another story may have been unfolding for 29 years. Quietly, privately, far away from the cameras that followed him everywhere else. The public saw certainty. The timeline shows contradictions. And once those contradictions started lining up beside each other, the image people trusted for decades suddenly looked very different. By the late 1960s, Cliff Richard was not just famous. He was everywhere. Television, radio, magazines, Christmas specials, stadium tours. His voice became part of everyday life in Britain. According to the BBC, he sold more than 250 million records worldwide over the course of his career. That number alone placed him among the biggest recording artists on earth. But numbers only explain part of it. What made Cliff different was trust. Parents trusted him. Churches praised him. Newspapers described him as polite, disciplined, and almost unusually clean-cut for a rock star. While other musicians were smashing hotel rooms or making scandalous headlines, Cliff Richard looked like the exact opposite of chaos. That image became his brand, and it worked. By the 1980s, he had already achieved something almost nobody else in entertainment history had managed. He remained relevant across multiple generations. Teenagers knew him. Their parents knew him. Even their grandparents knew him. Very few artists survive cultural change that long. Cliff did. The public persona felt stable, predictable, safe. But the records show something different. Behind the scenes, journalists had quietly noticed something unusual for years. Interviews often became strangely guarded whenever conversations moved toward his personal life. Relationships were vague. Timelines were blurry. Questions were redirected carefully and quickly. At first, almost nobody cared. Why would they? Cliff Richard was not marketed as dangerous or mysterious. He was marketed as dependable. And dependable celebrities are rarely investigated closely by the public. People assume they already know who they are. That assumption became incredibly important later, because once a public figure becomes emotionally connected to national identity, criticism becomes harder. Fans defend them automatically. Media outlets hesitate. Reporters become careful with wording. And in Cliff Richard's case, that protective wall around his reputation became extremely strong. Fast forward to the 1990s. The entertainment industry had changed completely. Tabloids were more aggressive. Celebrity culture had become invasive. Hidden lives were suddenly headline material. Careers collapsed overnight under public scrutiny. Yet somehow, Cliff Richard remained untouchable, almost protected. The world saw a man who had avoided scandal for decades. The reality was something else, because by this point, whispers had already started circulating quietly behind television studio doors and entertainment offices. Not loud enough to destroy a career, not specific enough to become a headline, but enough to make certain people wonder whether the public truly knew the man they had trusted for so long. And then, there is this. According to multiple interviews over the years, Cliff repeatedly described himself as intensely private, especially about relationships and emotional connections. On the surface, that sounds normal. Plenty of celebrities guard their personal lives. But some reporters began noticing a deeper pattern. The same questions appeared again and again, and the same answers never fully arrived. Nobody asked the obvious question, so he did. By the early 1990s, entertainment journalism had become far more aggressive than it had been during Cliff Richard's rise to fame. The old rules were disappearing. Celebrities who once controlled their own image suddenly found themselves facing non-stop tabloid coverage, leaked stories, hidden cameras, and public speculation that spread faster than ever before. Careers that had looked untouchable collapsed almost overnight. Yet Cliff Richard still seemed immune. That alone caught attention. Because the truth is, the British press had spent years digging into almost every major public figure from that era. Politicians, actors, musicians, television presenters. Nobody escaped scrutiny forever. Except, somehow, Cliff. And that is where the first real questions began. Not accusations. Questions. According to reports from publications like The Guardian and The Independent, journalists over the years repeatedly attempted to get clearer answers about Cliff's private life, especially his long-rumored relationships and the people closest to him. But interviews often followed the same pattern. The questions became personal. The answers became careful. Very careful. Sometimes he laughed them off. Sometimes he redirected the conversation toward religion, music, or work. Other times, interviewers later admitted they felt pressure not to push too hard. Here is what the statement left out. In celebrity culture, silence can become its own form of storytelling. When someone famous avoids discussing one part of their life for decades, the public begins filling the silence themselves. Rumors grow. Assumptions spread. Tiny details suddenly matter far more than they normally would. And in Cliff Richard's case, those details kept piling up. There were longtime companions who appeared constantly, but were rarely explained publicly. There were friendships that seemed unusually private for someone living under permanent media attention. There were reports from insiders claiming entire topics became unwelcome around management teams and publicists. None of that proves wrongdoing, but it does create a pattern. And patterns matter, especially when they repeat for nearly 30 years. Fast forward again. By the 2000s, the internet had changed celebrity culture forever. Old interviews resurfaced. Archived clips spread online. Fans started comparing timelines, comments, and public appearances in ways traditional media never had before. The result was uncomfortable, because many viewers began noticing inconsistencies that previously disappeared inside decades of carefully controlled publicity. One interview suggested one thing. Another suggested something else entirely. And every contradiction pushed curiosity further. The record shows something different. Around this same period, public fascination with celebrity double lives exploded. Audiences became obsessed with the idea that famous people could maintain one image publicly while hiding another privately. Books were written about it. Documentaries were built around it. Entire careers were destroyed by it, which made Cliff Richard's situation even stranger. The rumors never fully disappeared, but neither did the protection around his image. That balance lasted for years, until people started asking why. Be honest with me for a second. Before today, did you think Cliff Richard was exactly what he claimed to be? Yes or no? Drop it in the comments. I am genuinely curious how many people saw the signs, and how many of us were completely fooled. And this is where the story gets uncomfortable. Because once former interviews, old statements, and decades of carefully managed appearances were placed side by side, some observers started arguing that Cliff Richard had not simply protected his privacy. They believed he had constructed an entirely separate public identity, a version of himself designed specifically for audiences. The public Cliff and the private Cliff. Two different lives running side by side for nearly 3 decades. This was not an accident. The timeline makes that clear. By the time the 2010s arrived, something had changed. The conversation around celebrities was no longer just about fame. It was about authenticity. Audiences wanted the real version of public figures. Carefully polished images that once looked professional now looked suspicious instead. And suddenly, Cliff Richard's decades of secrecy stopped looking mysterious. To some people, it started looking strategic. The record shows something different. One of the biggest reasons was the sheer consistency of the image itself. Think about it for a second. Nearly 30 years in public life without a traditional celebrity relationship scandal. No public marriage. No confirmed long-term partner presented openly to the public in the way most stars eventually do. For some fans, that made him admirable. For others, it raised difficult questions. Because maintaining that level of privacy inside the entertainment industry is almost impossible without serious image control behind the scenes. Especially during the peak tabloid years of the 1980s and 1990s, when newspapers paid enormous money for personal details about famous people. According to former tabloid editors interviewed by British media over the years, major celebrity teams often worked aggressively to manage narratives before stories reached the public. Publicists built relationships with editors. Certain questions quietly disappeared. Certain rumors stayed unprinted. That system existed across the entire entertainment industry. But critics argue Cliff Richard benefited from it more than most. And then there is this. In multiple interviews across different decades, Cliff described loneliness in ways that surprised people. He spoke about isolation, emotional distance, feeling disconnected despite worldwide fame. Those comments hit differently later, because once audiences began revisiting them alongside the rumors surrounding his private life, some started wondering whether those interviews had contained clues hiding in plain sight the entire time. Nobody corrected the record, so he did. There were also long-standing reports about how tightly controlled access to Cliff became over time. Journalists who attempted to push deeper into personal territory often found interviews shortened or redirected. Friendly coverage continued. Difficult questions rarely did. Again, none of this proves criminal behavior. That distinction matters. But this story is not about proving crimes. It is about understanding how a public identity can become so carefully maintained that millions of people begin confusing image with truth. And in Cliff Richard's case, that divide may have lasted nearly 3 decades. Fast forward to one of the most damaging moments of his public life. In 2014, British police searched Cliff Richard's property in connection with historical allegations that were later not pursued. The BBC's helicopter coverage of the raid became one of the most controversial media moments in modern British entertainment history. According to the BBC and later court reporting, Cliff strongly denied all allegations and eventually won a major privacy case against the broadcaster in 2018. That event changed everything. Not because it proved guilt. It did not. But because it shattered the illusion that Cliff Richard existed above public suspicion entirely. For the first time in decades, people began openly debating the difference between the man and the image. The untouchable reputation cracked. And once that happened, old rumors resurfaced immediately. Past interviews were dissected online. Old photographs circulated again. Fans defended him fiercely, while critics argued the public had ignored obvious inconsistencies for years. The situation became deeply polarizing. Some saw a victim of media abuse. Others saw a celebrity whose carefully protected image had finally collapsed under scrutiny. Here is what the statement left out. The real damage was not only legal or financial. It was psychological. Because once the public begins doubting a celebrity's authenticity, every old interview changes meaning retroactively. Smiles look rehearsed. Answers sound scripted. Even ordinary moments suddenly appear calculated. That is the brutal side of fame. Once trust cracks, people start rewriting your entire history in real time. What comes next is the part that went deliberately unreported. We have sources below this video. Subscribe before you hear it, because once you know this, you will understand why it was kept quiet so long. And what happened next pushed the story far beyond celebrity gossip. Because the debate around Cliff Richard slowly transformed into something much larger. A conversation about how fame itself can create 2 separate realities at the same time. The public version, and the private one nobody ever truly sees. For years, criticism around Cliff Richard stayed mostly underground. Quiet conversations, tabloid whispers, Internet forum. Nothing powerful enough to seriously damage the image he had spent decades building. Then suddenly, the atmosphere changed. And once public doubt begins, it spreads fast. The 2014 police investigation became the turning point. Not because it led to charges, but because it destroyed the long-standing assumption that Cliff Richard existed outside controversy entirely. According to court reporting from the BBC and The Guardian, the public broadcast of the property search shocked Britain and triggered massive debate about celebrity privacy, media ethics, and public trust. But another thing happened at the same time. People started revisiting the past. Old interviews resurfaced online almost overnight. Clips from television appearances were analyzed frame by frame. Comments that once sounded harmless suddenly sounded loaded with hidden meaning to some viewers. Entire discussion threads appeared questioning whether the public had misunderstood Cliff Richard for decades. The world saw stability. The reality became uncertainty. This was not an accident. The timeline makes that clear. One reason the reaction became so intense was because Cliff Richard represented something bigger than music. For many British fans, he symbolized an older version of celebrity culture. Respectful, controlled, almost traditional. He was viewed as the anti-scandal celebrity in an era filled with chaos, which meant the idea of a double life hit harder than it normally would. People can forgive celebrities for wild behavior if that behavior matches the image already presented publicly. Rock stars acting recklessly rarely shock audiences. But when someone spends decades representing discipline, morality, and emotional restraint, even small contradictions feel enormous. And that emotional betrayal became the center of the conversation. The record shows something different. Some commentators argued the public had created the myth themselves. They claimed Cliff Richard never actually promised people perfect transparency. He simply refused to expose every part of his private life. Others disagreed completely. They believed the carefully maintained image had crossed into deliberate misdirection, a performance that lasted nearly 30 years because the media, fans, and industry all benefited from keeping it intact. That debate still exists today, and honestly, it may never fully disappear. Fast forward again. In later interviews after the investigation ended, Cliff spoke openly about emotional damage, fear, and the psychological impact of public suspicion. According to The Independent, he described periods where he struggled deeply with the humiliation and public pressure surrounding the case. For supporters, that proved he had been unfairly targeted. For critics, it complicated the story even more, because now the public was forced to hold two ideas at once. A man possibly damaged by media overreach, and a celebrity whose carefully managed image still left major unanswered questions behind it. Nobody asked the obvious question, so he did. Can someone spend decades protecting their privacy without living a double life? Or does maintaining two separate versions of yourself eventually become exactly that? Here is what makes betrayal different from other kinds of pain. It does not just hurt. It makes you question your own judgment. How did I not see it? How did I trust that? If you have ever felt that specific kind of shame after being betrayed, Cliff Richard's story is going to hit differently. Because by this point, the conversation was no longer really about one man. It had become about celebrity culture itself, about how public figures learn to survive by controlling perception, about how audiences confuse familiarity with honesty, and about how entire industries sometimes protect profitable images long after obvious cracks begin showing. By this point, very few people were paying attention, but they should have been. The strange thing about celebrity culture is this. The longer someone stays famous, the less people believe they are performing. That is what happened with Cliff Richard. For nearly 30 years, audiences did not just watch him sing or appear on television. They built an emotional idea around him. Reliable, respectable, safe. The kind of public figure who seemed frozen in time while the rest of entertainment became louder and messier. But the world never really knew this part, because fame does not reward honesty nearly as much as it rewards consistency. And Cliff Richard understood consistency better than almost anyone from a generation. Every interview reinforced the same image. Every appearance protected the same tone. Calm, controlled, careful. Even silence became part of the performance. The record shows something different. Over time, the real question stopped being whether Cliff Richard hid parts of his private life. Most celebrities do that. The larger question became why the public needed him to remain exactly the same for so long. That pressure matters. According to entertainment analysts interviewed by British media during the aftermath of the 2014 controversy, long-running celebrity brands often become psychologically tied to public comfort. Fans do not just consume the celebrity. They depend on the familiarity of the image itself. And once that happens, revealing the full truth becomes dangerous for everyone involved. The celebrity risks losing the audience. The audience risks losing the illusion. So both sides quietly continue the performance together. that may be the real story here. Not one dramatic hidden secret, not one shocking revelation, but an entire public relationship built on selective truth for almost 3 decades. And honestly, that possibility unsettles people more than scandal sometimes does, because it forces us to admit something uncomfortable about fame itself. We rarely know famous people at all. We know edited versions, carefully managed fragments, public characters built slowly over years of interviews, appearances, and media narratives. And once those narratives crack, even slightly, the audience suddenly realizes how much of the story was always missing. Fast forward to today. Cliff Richard still has loyal supporters around the world. Millions continue defending him passionately. Others remain deeply skeptical about the contradictions surrounding his image and private life. Both groups are reacting to the same thing: uncertainty. And uncertainty is powerful, because unanswered questions never really disappear in celebrity culture. They survive for decades, quietly waiting for the moment public perception changes enough for people to look back differently. And once they do, every old headline begins reading like a clue instead of a memory. Here is the part that continues bothering people even now. After decades in public life, millions still feel like they do not actually know who Cliff Richard really is. Not fully. That alone is extraordinary for someone who spent most of his life in front of cameras. The official account says one thing. The people watching closely saw something else. And somewhere between those two versions sits the truth, still incomplete after nearly 30 years of rumors, speculation, interviews, silence, and carefully protected image management. Cliff Richard is not the only public figure whose image raised difficult questions long after the cameras stopped rolling. We cover another story on this channel involving a beloved celebrity whose public identity hid a completely different private reality for decades. And honestly, the ending is even more disturbing. Go watch that next. The connections between the two stories are impossible to ignore.